Hello everyone! Welcome to this new section of the course. In this section, we will learn how to use some of the properties we talked about in the previous section, but in a 3D environment. Now, the major difference between 2D and 3D environments is the z-axis. In 2D environments, we have the x-axis, which is horizontal, and the y-axis, which is vertical. But in 3D, we also have the z-axis, which is perpendicular to both of them. Now, in order to create a 3D environment on a 2D plane, like the screen of our computer, we need to create something called perspective. You can think of perspective as the distance between our eyes and the computer screen. I think you'll understand it more when we see it in action, but I want you to remember that every time you want to work with a 3D environment, you need to define the perspective first. So, we will start with the translate property. In the previous section, we learned how to translate or move HTML elements, horizontally or vertically, using the translate X and translate Y functions. And now, we want to use translate Z and see what we'll get. So here in my HTML, I have just an image. And I'll go right here and add transform, translate Z, let's say 300 pixels. So when I hover over the image, I want it to move 300 pixels in the Z direction. But we said that before we use any of the 3D transform properties, we need to create perspective. And in order to do that, we use a property called perspective and add it to the container of the HTML elements we want it to transform. In our case, the container of the image is the body. So I will target the body and add perspective. And remember, we said that the perspective is the distance between our eyes, or the eyes of the viewer, and the computer screen. So it accepts values in pixels. So let's say 1000 pixels. And now, when I go to the browser and hover over the image, you see something interesting is happening here. The image is kind of getting bigger. The width and the height are increasing, just like what happened when we used the scale property in the previous section. But actually, that is not what's happening here. What's really happening here is the image is moving towards us. So it's getting closer to our eyes, and that's why it seems larger, but its width and height haven't changed. So now you can think of the z-axis as the line drawn between 2 points. The first point is our eyes, and the second point is the screen. So when we move the element along the z-axis, it will move along this line and it will either get closer to or move away from our eyes. For example, if I go back to my code editor and change this 300 pixels to minus 300 pixels, now when I hover over the image, you can see it's getting smaller because it's actually moving away from our eyes. I'll go back again and remove this minus. Great. So now, what is the perspective we added right here in the body? Well, before we talk about that, let's actually change it to 500 pixels and see what we'll get. So before I reload my browser, when I hover over the image, you can see the image is getting closer to me by 300 pixels in a perspective of 1000 pixels. So I'll refresh my browser to change to a perspective of 500 pixels. And then I'll hover over the image. And you can see in this case, the image is getting much closer than the first time with this new perspective. And that is because the new perspective is smaller. The distance now between our eyes and the image is 500 pixels. So when it moves 300 pixels towards us, then it will end up 200 pixels away from our eyes. While when we were using a perspective of 1000 pixels, it ended up 700 pixels from our eyes, so it seems smaller. Let's see another example. So I'll go back to my code editor and change this 300 pixels to any value bigger than the perspective, which is currently 500 pixels. So let's say 800 pixels. Now, before I hover over the image, let's imagine what'll happen. The distance between the image and our eyes is 500 pixels. And we want the image to move 800 pixels towards us. So what will happen is the image will move towards us until it goes past our eyes, and we won't be able to see it because it'll be behind us, or maybe behind our eyeballs and in our skulls, which sounds a little scary, but don't worry, it's safe. So when I hover over it, you can see it disappears beyond our eyes. So, to wrap things up, every time we want to create a 3D environment, we have to add perspective to the element container first. And the perspective is the distance between the viewer and the screen.
Please subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you will be notified with my latest videos and updates.